Sergei Prokofiev is considered one of the most prolific Russian composers of the 20th century. His compositions included sonatas for piano and violin, operas, and ballets. He also wrote concertos for cello, violin, and piano. Film scores, marches, overtures, cantatas, oratorios, suites, and symphonies were all included in the works composed by this often troubled but extremely talented composer and pianist. In today's episode of Music Appreciation Today, we're going to take a look at the life and times and compositions of Sergei Prokofiev, composer and revolutionary. Born in 1891 in what is now modern-day Ukraine, Prokofiev began his study of the piano at a very young age. His mother, a pianist herself, inspired him to pursue the instrument. Starting at the age of 3, he began to play, and by the age of 5, it was obvious that he had an incredible talent for music. He began composing his own pieces around this time, with the first being a piano composition that his mother would eventually write down for him. By 9 years old, Sergei was composing an opera called The Giant, as well as various other pieces. As Sergei got older, his mother decided it was time for some more formal education, and she approached the director of the Moscow Conservatory to arrange for some lessons in composition for him. As a result, Prokofiev spent the summer of 1902 under the tutelage of Reinhold Glier. His lessons that summer would ultimately culminate at the insistence of Prokofiev in an attempt to write a symphony. After some time, Prokofiev's mother decided the isolation of their hometown would not allow his musical talents to grow. And even though they did not want to set him on the path of a musical career at such a young age, they still wanted to see if they could move somewhere to continue his education. While on a visit to St. Petersburg, they were introduced to a professor at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. At this point, his repertoire of compositions was growing fast, and he applied to the school and was formally accepted. Prokofiev was viewed as arrogant and rebellious. He studied under various teachers with varying levels of satisfaction. He did graduate from his class in composition in 1909, but continued to study at the academy with an emphasis on piano and conducting. In 1910, his father died and his support then stopped, but by that time he was developing a name for himself as a composer. In 1914, he graduated again from the academy. He then made trips to London, where he would meet Sergei Diaghilev of the ballets Russes and Igor Stravinsky. As World War II proceeded, Prokofiev would again return to the academy to study the organ. He composed an opera based on a Dostoevsky novel, then wrote his first symphony called The Classical. Then, in 1918, as the atmosphere in St. Petersburg became dangerous with the possibility of it being captured, he headed abroad and for the USA. Prokofiev left Russia, traveled to Japan, and then went on to America, where he had some successful solo concerts and engagements. He would then produce an opera called The Love for Three Oranges, which unfortunately was never produced. As his career soon sputtered in America, he decided to head back to Paris in 1920. He met back up with Diaghilev and Stravinsky. He completed more compositions, including his first ballet called Shoot in 1921. This ballet was very well received and considered very successful. In 1922, Prokofiev moved to the Bavarian Alps with his mother to focus on his music. Then, in 1923, he moved back to Paris and got married to Spanish singer Lena Ubera. Also, his compositions were beginning to make a name for him back in his mother country of Russia, but at that point he wasn't ready to go back. The years of 1922 to 1932 were a prolific time for the composer. He wrote operas, ballets, concertos, and several symphonies during this time. Then, as the early 30s rolled on, he began to yearn for home and started to move things to his home country. In 1935, Prokofiev was finally home full-time. But the government of Russia at that time was very involved in the influence of music in the country, and exacted a great amount of control over what was considered acceptable. Nevertheless, Prokofiev produced some of his most well-known works at this time: the opera Peter and the Wolf, Violin Sonata No. 1 in F minor, Opus 80, and the three war sonatas were all written during this period. Then during World War II, the rules were relaxed and he was able to be more creative with his compositions. His Fifth Symphony and the ballet Cinderella were written. Then as the war ended, the government clamped down on artists and musicians regarding creative license. Prokofiev's works were then considered examples of formalism and anti-government. His works would not be played in theaters, and he found himself in financial troubles. At the same time, his health and the perceived quality of his compositions was declining. In 1953, Sergei Prokofiev died due to an unknown terminal illness. As we mentioned earlier, Prokofiev was very prolific. He has composed 10 operas, 9 ballets, 8 film scores, 11 symphonies, 16 orchestral suites, 6 piano concertos, 2 violin concertos, 3 cello concertos, 17 piano sonatas, 2 violin sonatas, and an extensive list of other various compositions that don't fit into any of these genres. At an early age, Prokofiev was encouraged to think on his own when composing. It was at this early stage in his career that he was laying the groundwork for his unique style. His use of tonality and atonality, dissonance, and unstable melodies were the trademark of Prokofiev's style. Not that his compositions weren't rooted in a classic sensibility, but he definitely put his own mark with respect to tonality, melody, and timbre. It was during the difficult years under the government of Stalin that it is said the so-called three war sonatas were composed. This series of pieces were thought to be the result of his experience involving the arrest and eventual execution of a close friend, Vsevolod Meyerhold. The emotions and expression of his feelings surrounding the incidents inspired some of the most dissonant piano music composed. The Piano Sonata No. 7 in B-flat major, Opus 83, is known as Stalingrad. It is the second of the 3 sonatas. Each of its movements embraces a sonata allegro form, A-B-A prime. For example, its first movement follows the standard sonata form with the exposition establishing the first theme, which is very percussive and harmonically dissonant and almost march-like in its rhythms. The exposition then moves into a second theme whose melody is more lyrical in nature. The development is characterized by unstable melody with no real center going through the variations of the theme. Then as the recapitulation unfolds, the listener finds themselves back at the material in the exposition. A repeat of the first and second themes that are heard earlier are presented in the tonic key of B-flat. The middle movement takes a less aggressive approach melodically. The opening theme is very smooth and flowing. However, it does not abandon its atonal approach at all, while the third and final movement goes back to a more percussive approach to its dynamics. Violin Sonata No. 1 in F minor, Opus 80, is said to have been inspired by some of Handel's violin sonatas. The forced structure movement of the Sonata di Chiesa with its slow, fast arrangement. Prokofiev began this piece in 1936 and did not complete it until 1946. Friend and professional associate David Oistrakh is said to have worked with Prokofiev on it as he was a violinist. He performed the piece at its premiere in 1946. Characterized as dark and somber, its movements seem to take you on a ride of anguish and despair. The initial theme in the first movement establishes a dark tone with the timbre of the percussive piano and haunting violin. Polyphonic texture and dark, dissonant harmonies and melodies characterize the movement. The movement ends with the violin's wispy scales that are said to represent wind over graves. As the second movement is in the typical sonata allegro form, A-B-A prime, the first theme is presented in the exposition and is at a much more increased tempo than the first movement. With the back and forth of the piano and violin in an almost calm response format, the movement moves into the second theme, which is much more lyrical in nature. However, the melodies of the two instruments are dissonant at times, creating a somber tone. Then the development section presents variations of the initial and second themes in various keys. We then return to the exposition themes in the recapitulation and the tonic key. The third movement begins with the lyrical theme, with the piano providing an almost homophonic texture. The third movement follows the sonata allegro form again, A-B-A prime. With an exposition, a development, and recapitulation sections, its tempo and dynamics are much slower and less percussive. The fourth movement is characterized by its toccata style with fast movement and very virtuosic playing. Also, there was a return to the theme from the end of the first movement, reminiscent of the wind over the graves. And this concludes today's episode of Music Appreciation Today. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of Sergei Prokofiev, composer and revolutionary. My name is Jim Johnson, and we'll see you later.